Hi everyone, I'm Jackie, and today in this video I will be covering the August 2025 SAT predictions for reading and writing. I have already released my predictions for the August 2025 math part of the exam, so be sure to check that video, linked below in the comments. And before we begin, like, rate, and subscribe if you like this video so I can keep making more amazing content for you. Okay, so per usual, let's jump in. Okay, so starting with standard English conventions, you're definitely want to know boundaries. So let's see the questions I think you should definitely know. Oh, this one. So it says Starlight is a 2021 sculpture by the French artist Camille Renard. Like many of Renard's works, Starlight, which depicts a dancer mid-twirl, attempts to capture the full spectrum of motion. Wearing a flowing light reflecting ground, the dancer spins through beams of silver and gold. Okay, so always when we do these, you want to check if you do have a independent versus dependent clause. So let's see this one here, where it says, like many of Reynard's works, Starlight, which depicts the dancer mid-twirl, attempts to capture the full spectrum of motion energy. So could that be a complete sentence? Yes, it can. And would this be a complete sentence? Wearing a flowing light reflecting crown, the dancer spins through beams of silver and gold. That also could be a complete sentence. Why? Because we have a subject, verb, and a complete thought. In this case, we don't have any periods, semicolons, or comma plus fanboys. However, looking at this, we do have a colon. And a colon, friendly reminder, when you use a colon, there always must be a complete sentence before the colon. And then we use the colon to either list off or to explain, which is exactly what is happening here. It is explaining how it captures the full spectrum of energy, and therefore B would be our answer. So in these cases, when you see a colon among the answer choices, remember that one, there always must be a complete sentence or independent clause before the colon. And then if what is set off is a explanation or a list of items, then it can be appropriately used. Oh, amazing. And just so you see fully what that would look like, here you go. We see it flows amazingly and grammatically makes sense. Okay, continuing our journey. Next up, in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, community gardens such as the Glenwood Green Garden, which spans nearly 3 acres, have become an increasingly popular source of fresh produce. Moreover, botanists and gardening has emphasized the importance of urban soil restoration and resident-led composting to make the initiative sustainable. Okay, so quick scan of the answer choices. I see that I'm dealing with names, and whenever we have names, it's going to come down to two choices, if it's essential or non-essential. So here, the two commas, well, sorry, two the two answer choices that have one comma each in them, this doesn't do anything from a grammatic standpoint. We can immediately eliminate them. This would be for non-essential information, which means that basically I can remove Dr. Vedanta Shiva from the sentence. And if the sentence still makes sense, that could work. And then option D would keep advocate Dr. Vedanta Shiva as a essential part of the sentence. So let's see. Moreover, botanist and gardening advocate. So imagine if I chose option A and it just put advocate here. Would that make sense? Moreover, botanist and gardening advocate has emphasized the importance. Grammatically, it makes no sense. For it to make sense, it might have to put, for example, like moreover, a botanist and gardening advocate. It needs the article, or we just keep the name. Moreover, botanist and gardening advocate Dr. Vandana Shiva has emphasized the importance do. So you see, whenever you have the names or titles types of exercises, which I do predict will be an August SAT, usually you can discard two of the four choices, just like you saw here. They'll only contain one comma. It will come down to if it's not essential or essential. And you can test just like I did here. Does it make sense just to write advocate? No, grammatically, it made no sense. So therefore, it must be option D. And just to put, this was the incorrect one. And here's our correct one. For those of you that are more visual and want to read the correct sentence. Oh my goodness, amazing. Next up, okay, this one. So author Sarah J. Maas has reached readers well beyond the young adult fantasy community. In 2016, her novel, A Court of Mist and Fury, was celebrated at a major book festival in the story's compelling, emotionally complex characters, richly imagined world, and feminist themes captivated audiences. Okay, so I scan the answer choices and I see that I'm placing the example. But first thing, whenever you see the semicolons occurring within the passage, you definitely are going to want to check for, is there an independent clause slash complete sentence followed by dependent clause, or independent, independent, dependent, independent? Let's see. So when I was reading, I noticed here in 2016, her novel A Court of Mist and Fury was celebrated at a major book festival in Edinburgh. Okay, so Edinburgh, this would be a complete sentence. I have the subject, I have verb, I have complete thought. It makes sense. And then reading from here, the story's emotionally complex characters, richly imagined world, and feminist themes captivated audiences. Also, a independent clause. So I have two independent clauses. Independent, independent. So knowing that I have two independent clauses, I can for sure eliminate option B and also option D. This would be a comma splice. And we can say, well, D is grammatically incorrect, but also comma splice, which a comma splice is when I separate two independent clauses with a comma. So now it is, now we need to determine, where do I place the example? Where is the example occurring? It seems that when I read the first sentence, it's reached readers well beyond the young adult fantasy community. This sentence is giving an example of how it's reached beyond that adult fantasy community. So, therefore, it seems it would be option A, which, remember, if you have a transition word, comma, transition word, in this case, for example, followed by a semicolon, if I were to place it at the beginning, so here we have, for example, well, I could put it at the beginning, for example, in 2016, da, 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 and it makes sense, then I know for sure that option A would be the answer. It's not option C, because if I put the example here, for example, the story's emotionally complex characters, richly imagined world, and feminist themes captivate audiences, we're not given an example of the themes of the book. We're given an example of how it reached beyond the fantasy community, and therefore I know it's option A. Isn't that amazing? And oh, look, I put it all together here in case you want to pause and read what it would look like in a complete passage or complete sentences. Continuing our journey. So here we have that the origin of the Renaissance lay in Italy was accepted by most scholars. Tracing its spread across Europe sparked ongoing debate. Okay, so again, scanning the answer choices, I'm seeing a bunch of boundaries. So I definitely want to see if I need to test for an independent clause. Are there two? Is there one? Let's go see. So starting here, that the origin of the Renaissance in Italy was accepted by most scholars. So a lot of students will say you can't start a clause or a sentence with that, but you can, and the SAT could test this on the exam, but it would be. So reading this, that the origin of the Renaissance lay in Italy was accepted by most scholars. That is complete. We have subject, verb, complete thought. And then from here, tracing its spread across Europe sparked ongoing debate. Also, an independent clause. So whenever we have two independent clauses or two complete sentences, independent, we would separate them with a period, a semicolon, or a comma plus fanboy. And in this case, D would win. So I think I'll get some questions about why isn't it A? You said previously, if you watched through the whole video, that I believe it was question one, that there must be a complete sentence before you place a colon, which is happening here. However, there is no list or no explanation occurring. It's just saying that the origin of the Renaissance lay in Italy was accepted by most scholars. It's not explaining how it was accepted by most scholars or listing off anything. So therefore, I have two separate ideas. It's just saying that tracing its spread across Europe is an ongoing debate. It's not connecting to this first clause, and therefore would be correct choice, option D. Oh my goodness, what an amazing question. Continuing. So here, digital, oh, look at my screen going crazy. Okay, so here, digital artist Marco Luis Ramirez primarily employs a variety of software programs to design concept art for animated films. To achieve the rich and immersive aesthetics that define his, he occasionally incorporates traditional artistic methods such as charcoal sketching. Okay, so again, we see there's commas, there's semicolons, there's periods. So I definitely want to check if there's two independent clauses. Let's begin. So here, to achieve the rich and immersive aesthetics that define his work, that it has a subject, it has a verb, but it does not have a complete thought. You see how it says to achieve the rich and immersive aesthetics that define his work? It should explain how we achieved it. If it doesn't, there's not a complete thought. So that would be a dependent clause. And then here, he occasionally incorporates traditional artistic methods such as charcoal sketching. That's independent. It can stand alone as a complete sentence. So whenever we have dependent with independent, we would use a comma to separate them. So we can immediately discard C and D. Whenever you have these choices, when there's just one comma, that's always incorrect. When you have the commas between the transition words, in this case, though, it's always going to have a double comma, which does make it non-essential. However, it also, imagine if we just removed it, it would still make sense. To achieve the rich and immersive aesthetics that define his work, he occasionally incorporates traditional artistic methods such as charcoal sketching. And therefore, we know that indeed it's option A. So you see, main takeaways of what I'm doing with all the boundaries questions is that I do read the whole sentences because sometimes, or the whole passage, because that could help provide context to determine where I need to determine if where the contrast is occurring or where the example is occurring. But then I'm like, okay, I need to determine, is this a dependent clause? This is independent. So I'm always determining if they are independent clauses or dependent. And then from there, I can make moves. Okay. And finally, so here, quick scan of the answer choices. I see that I'm dealing with verbs. And looking at this, I can see that this is singular, this is singular, this is singular, and the final option is plural. This I always call the 3 versus 1 split. And whenever this happens, I know for sure without even reading the passage that the answer is going to be the unique option. There's only one plural option, so it's plural. So if you recognize the 3-1 split, and this has appeared on, from what I've seen, 99.9% of exams, I would say 100%, but let's say 99.9% of exams, and maybe I haven't seen some of them, though I believe I have. But whenever you see this pattern, you can immediately answer. However, just to be precise and pristine, definitely just go back and check and make sure that you properly identify what the subject is in the sentence. So in this case, Calliope and Urania each link to a different domain. Where are, what is it referring to? The subject, Calliope and Urania. This would just be non-essential information to confuse us and maybe think that the subject is each, which is an indefinite singular pronoun. And that's it. You don't really have to read for these ones if you recognize the 3-versus-1 split, but it's helpful just to go back and test your grammatical knowledge anyways. Okay. And if you're into more of these type of exercises, boundaries, just check out the other videos I have on English and English hacks and boundaries for more practice. Continuing our journey into expression of ideas. So I am listing all the domains that will appear on your SAT score report, which the next one up is transition words. Well, expression of ideas, one of the subdomains would be transition words. So let's look here. So, with many breakthroughs like antibiotics, doctors were able to prescribe effective treatment shortly after identifying the infection. This wasn't the case with all diseases. The process of developing vaccine for malaria, for example, took several decades, more than 50 to be exact. Okay, so I'm definitely seeing a contrast. We see that there's shortly after identifying the infection, and then says this wasn't the case. So it's negating that it wasn't always short. And then it gives an example to say that it took several decades further. So I definitely want a contrast word. And the only contrast word I see would be granted. So granted, it is a concession, making a concession of the previous statement. And another classic synonym of granted that you could see would be that said. So that said and granted, among options A, C, and D, they appear on so many SAT exams. Make sure you feel comfortable with what granted is, a concession of the previous sentence. It's a contrast because maybe it will be on your SAT exam. Okay. And you can say, well, I didn't even put that said here, but here's some other contrast words. Nevertheless, however, despite that, even so, but also keep that said in mind. Okay, next up, marine biologist Sienna Day Kim hoped to reduce the harm caused by invasive species in coastal ecosystems. She pioneered a monitoring system that uses underwater drones to detect and track non-native species before they spread. Okay, so this seems like there was a hope. She hoped to reduce the harm. And then there's a cause, and then there's a reason of what she did. She pioneered a monitoring system to detect and track non-native species before they spread. So definitely a cause and effect relationship, aka consequence, would definitely lead me to believe that the answer is with this in mind. So with this in mind, some synonyms of that would be, oh, look, given this, in light of this, accordingly, and therefore. Okay, so it's helping to explain or there was a cause and what was the effect. The effect was that she pioneered this monitor system. Okay, so, with this in mind, it just means it's a cause and effect. Consequently, therefore, accordingly, could come up on the exam. Make sure you know it. Continuing our journey. So, with her immersive soundscape installation, Echoes of the Deep, Japanese composer Hanamori succeeds in creating a meditative yet disorienting experience. When listeners settle into the shadowy chamber and hear the layered whale calls reverberating through the walls, they are both calmed and unsettled, as if drifting into a surreal underwater dream. Okay, so this seems to be explaining her experience or people's experiences with echoes of the deep. And it's really emphasizing what happens when they are listening. So looking at the answer choices, the only one I see that really maybe expands upon or emphasizes, gives an example, would be indeed. It wouldn't be second. Second would be if there's steps in a process or a sequential time period happening. And nevertheless and instead are both contrast words, so we can both eliminate them. And therefore, it must be indeed. Okay, I didn't put examples of what it indeed would be, but indeed is just for emphasis. Emphasizing. Okay, amazing. Okay, let's look at this one. Commemorative ocean expeditions retracing traditional Polynesian navigation routes are sometimes referred to as Eddie voyages, a nod to the legendary Hawaiian waterman Eddie Aikau. As these journeys have shifted from practical seafaring reenactments to symbolic acts of culture preservation, contemporary Eddie voyages are rarely undertaken merely to replicate historical travel. They function as living ceremonies aiming to reaffirm ancestral knowledge, oceanic resilience, and indigenous identity in the face of ongoing cultural erosion. How beautiful. I hope I said his name right, Eddie Aikau. Aikau? You can let me know in the comments. So here, something that really jumped out to me was as these journeys have shifted from practical seafaring reenactments, da, da, da. So I see that there's a shift happening. And whenever I see a shift occurring within a passage, I immediately think that SAT is going to give me, a type of trend or shifting language would probably be the appropriate choice to put into the blank. And looking at the answer choices, the only one I really see is more often. And as the name seems or implies, more often, frequently, etc. So it's like saying that what the shift has gone to, and now these ceremonies have, or these voyages have turned into living ceremonies aiming to reaffirm ancestral knowledge, da 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 da. Nonetheless, and on the other hand, are both contrast words, so we can eliminate them. And it's not adding more information, it's helping to explain what the shift is. So you could very well see shift on your exam in these passages, or maybe you'll see like a trend, like trend in the actual passage. So when that happens, immediately think what I'm telling you. Oh, hey, maybe I need to think of trending type language. So here, some synonyms like often, frequently, these would be direct synonyms, but just other trend language that I've seen before that has appeared in SATs would be increasingly, which would indicate a increasing trend, but just something to keep in mind. So out of transition words, but still in the domain of expression of ideas is, oh my goodness, rhetorical synthesis. So take note, test takers, if you have been taught that you only need to read the question, that could be true, but you always want to double check with the student notes so that you don't miss any questions in rhetorical synthesis. So here it says that the student wants to compare some disadvantages of station-based and free floating car sharing programs. Which choice effectively uses relevant information from the notes to accomplish this? So let me read the notes. So it says, or the answer says, free floating programs may lead to inconsistent vehicle availability. Okay, that's something negative. Station-based programs, on the other hand, ensure availability and structured parking. It is comparing, but it is a negative with a positive. So that doesn't really work. B, worth noting is that so we see comparison, while free floating programs are flexible and convenient, ooh, a positive, they're less reliable than station-based programs. Okay, a negative. So no, because we also have the positive negative type relationship. Station-based programs require significant infrastructure. Not necessarily a good thing, but they avoid some of the challenges associated with free-floating programs. So here I can see station-based has a negative and free-floating also has a negative. That very well could be our winner. D, though free-floating programs offer flexibility, positive. Station-based car sharing programs provide vehicles for short-term rental. Well, I would say that's also positive. So in this case, the only one that really offers two negatives or disadvantages of station-based and free-floating car programs would be C. So in this case, we didn't really have to read the notes. It seemed to work out well that they're both discussing disadvantages. Okay. Amazing. Okay, next up into my amazing information and ideas type of questions. Right now, I'm going to focus on inferences / logically completes the text. So you're not going to see the exact same passages, most likely, but I am predicting the same line of reasoning to appear on the August SAT. You can let me know once you take the exam, but let's see. Okay, so here we have the Mauna Loa Observatory is projected to remain in operation till at least 2035, but it has already provided groundbreaking long-term measurements of atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, CO2, notwithstanding that only 8% of CO2 data sets analyzed by MLO are from urban regions. Climate scientist Dr. Elena Ruiz and colleagues assert that a new network of monitoring stations dedicated exclusively to urban emission zones would permit a detailed analysis of short-term CO2 fluctuations and seasonal emission trends in densely populated areas. Ruiz and colleagues' recommendation therefore implies that MLO. Okay, so before I even jump into the answer choices, what I like to do is really understand the passage and know what's happening, and then see if my prediction will match more or less the reasoning of the answer choices. So, things that jumped out to me was what MLO is known for, that it provides these groundbreaking long term measurements. However, so always look for the shift in the transition words, notwithstanding that only 8% of CO2 data sets analyzed are from urban regions. So if only 8% of data is urban, that would mean that the other 92% is non-urban. So do this like whenever you see percents, which I predict you will see percents within the logically completes the text messages in August, just think like, okay, it says only about 8% of da da da. What's the contrary? In this case, 92% would be non-urban focused for the global atmospheric CO2 or carbon dioxide. Okay, so then they give us some new information about Ruiz and her team, right? That Dr. Lenny Ruiz and colleagues assert that a new network of monitoring stations exclusive to urban emission zones will produce a detailed analysis of short CO2 fluctuations. Okay, blah, blah, blah. So what's happening here? There's short-term fluctuations. There's seasonal emission trends. In densely populated areas, and then they make this recommendation. Okay, so we know that MLO, the Mauna Loa Observatory, it seems like it's long-term. It's providing long-term data, whereas the new stations that they are dedicated to, they would be urban or short-term. Okay, so what's the underlying logic? To me, it doesn't seem like they want to shut it down. They just are looking for something that's different than what the MLO already provides. And like just seeing this piece of data of the 8%, I'm thinking hey, it's not really good at analyzing urban regions. Maybe the new projects that they're dedicated to would be better at analyzing urban data. Okay, so now let's look at the answer choices. So A, what's true about MLO? It will likely continue to be used primarily to observe global atmospheric patterns rather than urban emissions. I mean, maybe it wasn't very good at uh, analyzing urban emissions, so perhaps it would still be used to do other things. So I'm going to keep option A. B will no longer be used to collect climate data if stations recommended by Roos and colleagues are constructed. That's a red flag. It's way too strong. No longer be used. It never said that they're going to completely shut down the MLO, and it's also very vague to collect climate data. What kind of data? Like it can collect all sorts of data if it wants to. In particular, it seems to be really good at collecting non-urban data. So in any case, no longer to be used. I don't like that language. There was no implication of that. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that one. If you see strong language like this within your answer choices on the exam, then I would recommend a similar approach. C can be retrofitted to provide the urban level data that Ruiz and colleagues are seeking. Why would it be retrofitted? Retrofitted would like imply that it's changing it when it clearly states in the passage that Ruiz implies to put new stations or a new network. So retrofitted makes no sense. And option D lacks the sensitivity to detect atmospheric changes and carbon dioxide over short time periods. Did they talk about sensitivity anywhere in the passage? It just says it basically lacks urban coverage. So you see how these ones, retrofit and sensitivity, weren't even mentioned. So I'm just going to go ahead and discard them. And I can see option A would be our winner. And this is logically complete to text. It's not 100% true, but it's likely that that's what will happen based on the evidence provided in the passage. Okay, let's do another one. Okay, next up, this one. So it says the physiological peculiarity of underground plant roots, their environment largely devoid of light, complicates comparisons with other plant tissues, particularly leaves, in which photoreceptors along a vertical light gradient regulate development. Roots, once assumed to be entirely blind to light, have recently been found to exhibit subtle light responses even deep in the soil. In a study investigating this phenomenon, researchers applied genomic techniques from Amado plant species with well-mapped light response genes to root cells in pea plants. The researchers expected only limited photoreceptor reactivity, but instead discovered robust expression of blue light receptor genes in root tips and red light receptor genes scattered throughout the lateral root branches, suggesting what? Okay, so always look if you're having difficulty with the type of scientific passages here, really just break it down because we can see that the roots, they assume to be entirely blind. And then we see a shift recently been found to exhibit subtle light responses even deep in the soil. So look for there's the old view versus new view. And you want to focus on the new view, which in this case was that roots, maybe they do have subtle light responses, even if they're deep down in the soil. And then a study was trying to use genomic techniques to the root cells in pea plants. And what did they expected only limited photoreceptor activities. And then take note again at the transition word, but instead discovered robust expression of blue light receptor genes in root tips and red light receptor genes scattered throughout the lateral root branches, suggesting what? So In these cases, this is usually a pattern. There's some old belief, old hypothesis, and then there's some recently found new, well, new finding, or maybe a new technique, maybe a new hypothesis. You want to focus on that new hypothesis. So let's look at the answer choices. So A, despite the general assumption that light perception is negligible in root tissues, widespread expression of red light receptors suggests that lateral roots respond dynamically to changes in soil composition, not to light itself. Well, um, that totally ignores the data. And it's a total contradiction, because it's saying that the lateral roots respond to changes in soil composition, not light itself. No, the study is saying that they do respond to light itself. So this is a classic, maybe it sounds good and technical, but it's actually an example of a contradiction. So when this happens, eliminate, but also just to show they like to use advanced vocabulary is negligible, just to show that just means insignificant. It's just a good SAT word to know for any type of passages, but especially for the reading comp section. So option B, oh, long with uh, contrary to the long withstanding view that light exposure is irrelevant underground. That was the first part of the hypothesis. So this part I'm going to give a check mark to. Root systems have evolved a complex photoreceptive map that responds differently to blue and red light waves. Maybe like it is addressing the old belief, and then it's suggesting a new insight that they have this photoreceptive map that responds differently to blue and red light waves, which was exactly what was happening, right? Blue light in root tips and red light genes were scattered throughout the lateral root branches. So there's some like spatial pattern of some light sensing gene expression. So maybe. Let me see if I can discard the other ones. C, although pea plants and um, Arabidopsis share a distant evolutionary relationship, the absence of green light receptor activity in PS roots suggests that green light is largely backed by soil. Well, this is easy to eliminate because there was no mention of green light. So no mention, we can eliminate. And D, rather than simply lacking photoreceptive ability due to limited light exposure, as previously believed, root cells' responses appear to reflect a retained ancestral capacity to detect specific wavelengths underground. Okay, retained ancestral capacity to detect specific wavelengths underground. That seems strange. It's not really supported anywhere in the data. And more importantly, it's not giving any explanation of the specific pattern of this blue versus red gene expression, which does seem like it would be important based on all the evidence in the passage. Okay, so therefore it must be B. And I know some students will like to argue that, okay, but I could have said that evolution wasn't really discussed in the passage here. But knowing what evolution is, like we found that here, it's basically trying to say that there's non-random specific patterns, right? There's like blue light in one area, red light in another area. So this is a pattern and it suggests that there's adaptation, meaning that it's not random or accidental. So in science, when something has evolved, it doesn't mean that we need like a whole a sentence before or a paragraph explaining what evolution is, just that if we see that there is some shift occurring over time, we can say that it has evolved, just to, keep it in mind. But always do process of elimination for sure, because then you can really see that the other choices do not go. Okay. And you see that there is always one that's like, oh, that kind of sounds good, but it's actually a direct contradiction. And then usually one to two, there's usually one or two contradictions. In this case, there is one contradiction, and there's two that just introduce information that isn't really mentioned and we can't infer. Okay. Wasn't that such a good one? Okay, let's look at this one that it would be under information ideas, and I think you'll have something similar about finding quotations that support the student's claim. So here, in a paper for an art history class, the student claims that Claude Monet's 1872 painting Impression, Sunrise, marks a significant shift in Monet's approach to painting and helped define a new artistic movement. So I know going into this, I'm looking for some significant shift and a new movement being defined. So, like some departure from the earlier style into what he's doing now. So, let's see. Prior to Impression Sunrise, Monet's landscapes were more detailed and conventional in their treatment of light and form. So, here it does have something that happened before Impression in landscape. And this would show a shift that I guess now they weren't so detailed and conventional. So maybe option B, Impression Sunrise was among the works included in the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874. Um, Interesting, but doesn't show any shift happening. Many viewers at the time criticized Impression Sunrise for its lack of finish and clarity. So that's just people reacting to the painting. It's not explaining it specifically what the change in Monet's technique was. And D, Monet painted many scenes on the same harbor, yet none became as well known as Impression Sunrise. This is about popularity, not the shift that occurred in his paintings. So therefore, I'm feeling good about option A. Okay, so, just feel good about those. And now I'm going to go into craft and structure questions. So I'm first going to start off with vocabulary. The vocabulary I'm about to present to you, I feel you'll see similar ones on the exam. They've been repeated on multiple SAT exams. It's good language to know, even if they don't come up in the actual words and context passages. Maybe you'll see them within the reading passages themselves. So just something to be familiar with. So here, felsic and mafic rocks differ significantly in composition, texture, and eruption style. The high silica content in felsic magma is why felsic rocks can be those that are merely mafic, rich in magnesium and iron. The mafic basalt may cool rapidly on the surface, but its composition does not lead to explosive eruptions, as does the felsic rhyolite. So it seems to me, just without even looking at the vocabulary, that there's this relationship, between the felsic and magmatic rocks, in particular, that they're very different in their behavior, specifically their eruption style. So let's see. So I'm looking for something that would, fit that context. So looking at our answer choices. So we have demarcated from. That could be good because demarcated means different from or distinguished from something else. So I'm liking that. Reconstituted. Well, to constitute would mean to form. So this just means to like reform or remake. It's not talking about that. Conflated with a very amazing SAT word that just means to like blend something together. It can also be to confuse something. So it could be a very tempting choice. I know a lot of SAT test takers go for conflated, but ultimately it just doesn't make sense because we're not confusing or in the other context blending anything together. And derive just means to like originate from or come from, which we're not defining any origin story. So therefore, like we could say it's different from or distinguished from, which has the same meaning. And therefore, that fits my prediction, and I'm feeling good about demarcated from to be the correct answer. Amazing. Continuing our journey. So this one, rejecting the premise that the scientific journal evolution of human behavior, formerly ethology and sociobiology, should privilege purely biological explanations for human conduct. Editor Dr. Stephen W. Gangstein welcomed interdisciplinary submissions that integrated cultural, physical, and contextual perspectives. Gangstein's inclusion editorial vision diverged from the approaches of Lita Comses and John Tobley, whose decisions for their publications were more rare. Okay, so we can see like Dr. Gangstein, he welcomed these submissions that integrated cultural, physiological, and contextual perspectives, and it was very inclusive. And then we see that it diverged from approaches of these people whose were more, so I would think like not not inclusive or are not, they're very rigid. Mm. So looking at these ones, proficient, no. Dogmatic, maybe. It means rigid or unyielding. Ambiguous, meaning like unclear. That doesn't make sense. And unpretentious, like humble, also doesn't make sense. So I know dogmatic would be our winner. And dogmatic, it's a popular SAT word. It means very rigid or like very held in your one sided belief system. You don't want to change your opinion or your viewpoints. So you're not very inclusive. Amazing. Continuing our journey. So this one, the results of standardized assessments evaluating the effectiveness of inquiry-based science curricula sometimes fail. Findings that educators report based on classroom engagement and student-led experimentation. While there are several possible reasons for this, one is that standardized tests may inadequately capture collaborative learning gains and critical thinking skills that the curricula aim to foster. Oh, interesting. A debate about standardized tests on the SAT. So it's saying that the educators um, yes, it fails to what findings that educators report, blah, blah, blah. There are several possible reasons that they may inadequately capture collaborative learning gains that the curricula aim to foster. So, because it seems like the educators, they're observing these positive outcomes, which would be engagement and student-led experimentation. But standardized tests, they don't show engagement or student-led experimentations. So it seems like the tests don't really support or confirm what the teachers actually can see. So let's see. Circumvent, amazing SAT word, but it means to go around something or bypass, go around, avoid. That they don't fail to bypass findings. It's just like it fails to support or confirm. Oh my goodness. Guess what corroborate means? Exactly. Support, confirm. So that's most likely our winner. But just to make sure you have a good range of vocabulary, disseminate. Um, disseminate means to spread widely, um, usually in regards to information, which we're not talking about spreading information here. And then to implement would just mean to like put into place. So also doesn't really fit. And therefore corroborate. Okay, but all of these words are amazing to know. In this case, corroborate was our winner, but circumvent, corroborate, disseminate, implement, who knows? Maybe you'll see them on the SAT. Okay, let's look at one final one. So this one, one popular theory of the origin of the universe, the inflationary multiverse, posits that our observable cosmos is just one of many bubble-like universes formed during a rapid expansion after the Big Bang. Until recently, the multiverse was, but physicist Alan, so but physicists Alan Guth and others have developed mathematical models suggesting testable predictions that lend indirect support to the theory's plausibility. Okay, so it seems like they had this popular theory, and then it was really just basically pretty theoretical. And it still is, but it seems like there's a bit more support for it because there's testable predictions that are leading to support that the theory could actually be plausible. Okay, so like it was once just mainly conceptual, but now it seems like they actually might have a bit more evidence to prove its validity. So let's check the answer choices. Desultory. That makes no sense. Desultory just means like lacking a clear plan or purpose. So like aimless, no plan, no purpose. Doesn't make sense. Spurious. Well, spurious just means something that's false or fake or not genuine, which also doesn't make sense. It's not that it was false or fake. It's just, it's theoretical. Next, veritable. Well, veritable would be the opposite of spurious, which is truthful, true, genuine. The multiverse, until recently, the multiverse was true. That doesn't make any sense. Oh, it must be option D, notional, which does mean that it was, it literally means something that's speculative or it's an existing theory, like theoretical, hypothetical. But and although it still is, it was solely only notional, like meaning that it was just previously this conceptual idea. However, now it has a bit more support to make it not so notional. There's a bit more evidence backing it up. So even though it is theoretical still, it has more evidence to support it. So it's not so like conceptual in thinking. Okay, weren't those amazing words? Yes, they were. So just make sure you know those ones. I feel like you could see similar ones on the exam. But now let's look at a couple of other craft and structure type questions that I think could appear on your SAT exam. So starting with function questions fall under craft and structure. Make sure you're familiar with them. I feel like you could have one of these where it talks about the third sentence in the overall structure. So let's look at this one. So it says the Solara satellite system was first developed in Northern Europe, where the solar flare cluster Helios 9 regularly interfered with its transmissions. In 1972, solar units were deployed in South America, far from any Helios 9 activity. But interference patterns between satellites and solar events can persist across decades and hemispheres. Around 2010, Helios 9 was detected in the southern sky near Argentina, where physicists Maya Trin and colleagues had been monitoring solar receivers. Within 6 months, 88% of the units had experienced signal degradation due to the flare activity. Okay. And it says, which choice best describes the function of the third sentence in the overall structure of the text? So we just really want to focus on how did this play a part into the overall structure of the passage, and looking at the overall breakdown, which is the first sentence is just describing the origin of the solar system in Northern Europe and its problem with the interference with Helios 9. And then it says sentence 2 that Solara was later deployed in South America, right? And then third sentence, it's saying that interference can persist across decades and hemispheres. And then continuing the passage, it just talks about how Helios was detected again. So to me, this seems to be making some broad claim about satellite solar flare interference. And then it furthers this claim or helps to prove it with this example. So let's see if any answer choices match the structure. So option A, it states the hypothesis that training colleagues had set out to investigate using Solaris satellites and Helios 9. Um, they this sentence in particular, like sentence 3, it's not stating a hypothesis. That doesn't make any sense. Option B presents a generalization that is exemplified by the discussion of the solar system. Oh, that's what happens in sentence 4. And this is just giving a generalization, the patterns that happen between the decades and hemispheres. So maybe. Option C, it provides context that clarifies whether the satellite system mentioned expanded to new regions. But that's not what happens in sentence 3. It doesn't talk about why it expanded to new regions. That was already established in the second sentence. So eliminate. And D, it offers an alternative explanation for the findings of training colleagues. No. If anything, it's foreshadowing some explanation for their findings. It's not giving an alternative explanation or a contradiction. Hi. So it must be option B, which did match my prediction. But when you're doing these type of questions, the overall structure or function questions, just ask yourself, does it make a claim or does it provide an example? Is it a specific example or is it general? And then you do want to look for what comes before and after. Like, is it contrasting information previously? Is there elaboration? Is there a cause and effect? And then do you process elimination like you saw I did here? Okay, so be familiar with those types and, feel good about them for the SAT reading. Okay, and next up, another craft and structure question asking about the overall structure of the text. Advanced Module 2 style question. So this one, why do hummingbirds hover while sparrows flap from perch to perch? Biologists suggest that this difference in flight behavior may stem in part from the shape of the bird's wings. Hummingbirds, which are smaller than sparrows, have short, tapered wings and shoulder joints that allow for a full rotation, enabling them to hover in place. By contrast, sparrows have longer wings built for forward motion and lack the shoulder flexibility that hovering requires. These adaptations allow sparrows to conserve energy over longer distances. The same traits may also prevent most birds from remaining stationary in midair. Okay, so pretty interesting. Um, something, there's a question, and then there's a hypothesis that's being offered in the second sentence. And then it explains a bit more the biological traits between hummingbirds and sparrows. And then it makes maybe like a claim or generalization about them. Okay, so let's just see if we can discard any of the answer choices. The text compares the diets of two birds, that explains how those diets, totally off topic. Eliminate. B, the text presents a theory about two species, then examines how other theories contrast with it. Well, this part's okay. There is a theory. Well, is it two species or two birds? But examines how other theories contrast with it. Did they mention any other theories? This is the classic other trap. C, the text poses a question about two species, then provides an explanation that may account for the differences. That could maybe make sense. And I guess they are two species. um, Two species, the hummingbird and sparrow, provides an explanation that may account for their. Yes, right? It says that this could allow sparrows to conserve energy and maybe may also prevent most birds from maintaining stationary midair. Maybe. C, the text describes a feature common to two species, then explores why it appears differently in each one. Um, well, it sounds clever, but I would say structurally incorrect because guess what? There was no feature that was common or shared between the two species. So therefore, it must be correct choice C. Oh my goodness, wasn't it amazing? Okay, so that ends my reading and writing predictions for August 2025 exam. Just be really confident with everything I discussed here, included but not limited to boundary questions, information ideas, logically place the text, overall structure, know these vocabulary words, take note of the rhetorical synthesis, and so on. So thank you per usual for watching these videos. Like, rate, subscribe if you like the video. If you want to see more, you have any questions, comment below. Tell me if you like it. You can like or dislike. Haters that dislike, you don't bother me. And I will keep making videos for all the people that like the videos. So thank you, Goen, so much for watching. If you watch all the way to the end, good luck on your SAT exam. I hope you do amazing. And thank you again. Comment below if you have any questions or doubts. Bye, guys. See you in the next video.